Trump poll numbers. Again, poll numbers maybe, pale in comparison to the actual danger associated with a lot of the strategies being employed in the Gulf right now. But because you are a political guy, I mentioned the poll numbers because they can have an effect on the midterms. But the reality of what's going on in Iran seems as though it's escalatory. It doesn't feel as though the Americans are backing down and that the Trump administration is looking for an exit ramp anymore. He even noted over the weekend that he doesn't know if he'll even take the deal.
Yeah, I think a couple things are happening, Mark, and they're happening very quickly. One is, as you noted, the so-called 14-point plan that was offered by the Iranians. And frankly, I don't know exactly why the Trump people are letting the Iranians put these things on the table, except to, as that goes, somebody gives you a negotiating offer and you just go, well, that's absurd. Forget about it. The biggest sticking point, and this is being talked about internationally, the Brits came out over the weekend and said again, we're 100% behind the U.S. and NATO in the one single, critical in their minds negotiating point, and that is no nuclear weapons for Iran. Okay. And that is not on the table right now for the Iranians. Apparently, they have not agreed to that. And that is what is keeping any kind of a plan. Forget all the rest of the things we could talk about. That one open. That's even more critical, Mark, in the longer term, of course, in allies' minds than the Strait or Hormuz. Then secondly, the Strait itself. Okay. So the pressure's been building, as you know, to get commerce moving. That started happening over the weekend. CENTCOM, the U.S. Central Command, has reported 2 U.S. flagged commercial ships were escorted through the strait. That has happened. There's others that are coming through. Trump told other nations, that, look, if you want to bring your ships through, we'll do our very best to basically protect them. That has infuriated the Iranians. That is their Trump card, pun intended, as you know, is keeping that strait closed and issuing tariffs on it, et cetera, et cetera. And it looks like, the allies, most particularly the U.S., is ready to break that hegemony. They're ready to say, okay, enough is enough. We're going to start bringing ships through here and essentially daring the Iranians to come after them. Now, this report, the third thing is this report on attacks on American vessels. I mean, CENTCOM has reported over the weekend, they took out 6 so-called small boats in the Iranian Navy. Why small boats? Because that's what's been used in the strait. And secondly, there are no big boats left in the Iranian Navy, okay? So 6 of them were taken out. That too has infuriated the Iranians. This thing about 2 missiles striking a Navy warship, most notably a destroyer, there's no independent confirmation of that, Mark, from international sources or American news sources. And I just caution people, respectfully, when you hear things from the Iranian news service, it's really important to remember it's a state-run news service. It is not a free press. So when we get things out of there, it's really important. It doesn't have to be, a U.S. aligned press or whatever, but you want to hear something. You want to hear something from the BBC or somebody who can independently confirm that. And we haven't gotten that yet.
I'll get to Hegseth in a moment, Mondo. I just wanted to warn you. I think that's a Kim cut. She'll run it. But I wanted to offer up to you, Gary, cut 7. This is about dignity and honor and the importance of those things in these negotiations. It kind of appears that dignity and honor have left the building quite some time ago. I just say the general sense of the discourse has taken on an ugliness from the very beginning that doesn't leave a lot of room. I mean, you're talking just rhetorically now for either side to kind of save face. So it's a very difficult negotiation to navigate anyway. And there was a pretty good little run. Can you get this for me, Mondo? Cut 7. This John Mersheimer, who's the professor out of University of Chicago, I think is where he is. And I read his Substack, and I think he's got some interesting stuff. And he talks about this dignity and honor question. If we can't get the cut for you, then I'll just get your reaction. Do you have it, Mondo? Cut 7, it would be. Again, these negotiations. We talked about this before, Gary. In fact, I was mentioning to you, and I think you were agreeing that having these negotiations, you kind of just noted it yourself, kind of when the Iranians come out and talk about things publicly, when these negotiations go on in public, it's much, much harder to reach some kind of agreement because both sides just have more to lose at that point. Go ahead and speak. We'll see if we get this cut for you at some point.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Mark, on both counts. First, you mentioned saving face. You and I talked about that 3 or 4 weeks ago. And I said, if you're smart about this, you've got to get the Iranians an off ramp. You got to find a way so that they don't, in the international community, and more importantly, in their own internal audience, don't have to, sometimes Trump and the Pentagon wave the white flag. Okay, that's not going to happen. I mean, in a public sense, the Iranians need to find a way to, and they have a want to claim total victory themselves, right? I mean, much like Trump does. So
for their party or their ability to do anything, given the massacre that's going to happen in November. And a lot of that is, of course, because of this economic crisis created by this war and now by this blockade.
And the blockade takes time to work. But John, the critics, I'm sorry to drag on about this, but as you know, on this program, we like to hear the opponent's arguments because that makes your arguments even
Thompson
stronger when you understand their arguments at their best. They would say that because the blockade might take a bit longer, that's where a resumption of military strikes might be necessary to shorten the timeline. After all, the US and Israel still control the skies over Iran. So can you see this as a point where the Americans might resume hostilities?
I make 2 points, Tom. The mere fact that they do not want to rely on the blockade alone, and they're talking about bringing military force to bear, air power to bear against Iran, tells you that they don't have that much faith in the blockade and supports what Rita and I are saying. The second point is, I think if we start using military force, it will not work, and the Iranians will retaliate, and it will have even worse consequences for the international economy, and it will give the Iranians more, not less leverage. If I were playing Iran's hand, I would hope the Americans would attack me. I don't think the Iranians have as much interest in the status quo as they do in restarting the war. Because if you restart the war, the economic consequences for the West will be disastrous.
Yeah, now, while that may be true, Gary, and thanks for that, I don't agree with him on that. I mean, I think the notion somehow that the Iranians would want an escalation, I think that's a bit on the side of lunacy. I understand that they do have leverage here, but there's a lot that's unpredictable once this thing goes to another level. I mean, I think there'll be bloodshed on both sides. It'll be pretty horrible on both sides and for the international economic community, but I'm sure you'd agree. I don't see that as a want on the part of the Iranians.
Yeah, and I think it's a mistake to see this as a binary choice. Either just a blockade or military action. What's clearly going on inside the Pentagon and inside the White House is, what button do we push when? Right? I mean, we have the ability now that the allies, most notably the U.S., but also the Israelis, have fully restocked their weaponry. We even have more firepower in the area now and more varied firepower. By the way, what took out those 6 small boats were attack helicopters. Not missiles, not F-35s. So the array of military assets and options have grown for the U.S. and Israel. I don't see that, and this is why I think the Iranians are reacting so vociferously today after this weekend. I don't think they feel like they have much left in terms of leverage other than the Strait of Hormuz. That is it. I mean, they're, our allies in the Middle East around them. The Middle Eastern states continue to get a missile or two, but really the Iranian capacity has been degraded so significantly that if there is a way that the strait can be reopened to commercial shipping, that and the blockade of Iranian ports in terms of their own oil exports is maintained, those are the 2 things right now, most experts agree, are going to have the kind of leverage that could finally bring Iran seriously to the negotiating table.
Yeah, this is a really interesting thing that Gary's saying, and this is something that is worth dwelling on for a moment, because there are differing minds on this. The idea somehow that the Americans lose leverage because the Iranians control the strait, and then the notion that, no, the Iranians lose leverage because the Americans control the Iranian economy now and can shut it down to the point that there's going to be even more real suffering in Iran. And it is true, there is already real suffering. Now, there has been for decades, right? And then the argument goes, right, Gary? Well, the Iranians are used to this deprivation. They've had it under sanction for ages. And you get to the back and forth. And I just don't know how to game that out. But you think it's a much closer call, is what I'm getting from you, than might be played out in like people like Mersheimer and others who claim that the Iranians have all the leverage or much of the leverage at this point.
Well, if you listen to the people that have been studying this and have been analysts in this region for years and years, Mark, they'll tell you that those sanctions, the Trump people have made crowed about this a lot too. They were circumvented in all kinds of ways, right? I mean, the so-called, the flagships of other countries. China was still getting a huge portion of its oil. People don't realize 70% of Chinese oil is imported, and a big chunk of that from right there in Iran. So, a lot of those sanctions, yes, they were in place, but you weren't bolting down the Iranian oil economy like it's happening now. I mean, this is unprecedented in terms of leverage on Iran, which is why most experts agree. There's people saying now they've got about a week or two left of storage capacity. Those Iranian oil wells are still pumping, but it's not able to be shipped. So they're running out of places to put this oil, which, the petroleum experts will tell you, that means they're going to start shutting down wells. When that happens, you got a much bigger problem.
Yeah. Here is Trump speaking over the weekend to a friendly crowd there at the Villages in Florida. That's Trump country, talking about the fact that we might be better off not making a deal with Iran at all. Here you
go. So you'll be all very happy. And, it's right now I own Doral, and right now we have a tournament. I'm so busy. And we have the big Cadillac Championship going on, all the great players, the PGA Tour. And they're there. And yesterday somebody came up, said, "Sir, the tournament is great." I said, "What tournament are you talking about? I'm so busy with the Iranians trying to make a good deal, and we're not going to let that happen. But they've got to make a bad deal. But if they make a deal at all, because frankly, maybe we're better off not making a deal at all. Do you want to know the truth? Because we can't let this thing go on. Going on too long. But under the
idea somehow that this wouldn't happen, and then you get to poll numbers that are, as you're well aware, at the supreme lows that he's ever seen. I'm wondering if this is getting through to him. What's your sense of, he's well aware of the polls. You referenced earlier in that speech, the polls are fake. I know the polls say I'm not popular. Talk to me about how American policy is being shaped in regard to the politics of it.
Yeah, well, Trump's been and his people have been trying to hold firm against eroding poll numbers throughout this year, as you know, Mark. And here's the deal. I think that was just a throwaway comment, as Trump so often does, especially from the stump. Oh, we're better off not making a deal. That's just the classic negotiator's way of saying, oh, I don't care as much about a deal as you do, right? I don't think anybody takes that seriously. It's just one more kind of throw on the pile of the negotiating leverage. But poll numbers are a big deal. And the new ABC Washington Post poll that came out today is not good news for Republicans. Let me tick down a couple numbers real quick. The presidency is one thing. He does have low approval numbers. He's had them in the past, but now they're saying in the in the Washington Post ABC poll, lowest they've ever recorded. But the bigger problem, Mark, are the congressional numbers. The bigger problem is the new divergence in the so-called generic House race. Are you more likely to, vote for a Democrat or a Republican this fall? That had been holding steady at about 2% advantage for Democrats. Now it's more than doubled to 5%. All right. That's one thing. That's not a good thing. Then you have the so-called enthusiasm gap. This is really important. How committed are you to actually, with certainty, cast a ballot this fall? Democrats are leading that. We're only 6 months out from November. That is not good signage, okay? You want to have your base at least fired up. And the MAGA base is. But the more, they call them, now their media is referring to them as the non-MAGA Republicans, okay? Aren't as enthusiastic. And the, formerly Trump-leaning independents, not as enthusiastic. Those are numbers that are worrying people, certainly on the Hill, and I have to be increasingly doing so inside the White House.
When you talk about those MAGA Republicans, Megyn Kelly has really waved the flag for Trump. and she's really been, in strong MAGA country, angry about the war, I might add. And here she is talking about the fact, it's cut 8, please, Kim, talking about the fact that he's done, that these poll numbers actually reflect the kind of repudiation that is put a fork in him type thing. Here, give her a watch.
Trump has cratered. I mean, cratered. It's like not even present tense anymore. It's done. Just 23% approve of his overall performance. 21% of independents support this war on Iran. 21. You've got 79% of independents who are against. Folks, you cannot win elections like that. Democrat or Republican, you got 80% of the independents against you. You're effed. You need to adjust something ASAP. And listen to this. How many independents approve of Trump's job performance when it comes to the cost of living? 12. They were already suffering and they were blaming him. And then we launched a war of choice that was not necessary. And their gas prices went up and energy prices are going up. So this pain is likely only to get worse. And this war needs to come to an end right away. At least now President Trump seems to want it. Unfortunately, as the old saw goes, it's very easy to start a war and very difficult to end one. The
so
Iranians get a say.
Yeah, she says it more much in a different way than you do. I'm laughing because she said, I've never seen, she's full of like expletives. She's very arch in everything she says now in this new environment that she occupies. But she's kind of saying what you're saying when it comes to independence, et cetera,
Oh, yeah, 100%. I mean, look, Megan's doing a podcast, right? You can drop F-bombs. I mean, I'm a broadcast guy, Mark. Yeah. I don't have that luxury, right? And so, and that's Megan's thing now. I mean, she's far more bombastic now than she ever was when she was a broadcaster, as on Fox. Seriously, you have the luxury of doing that when you have a podcast. Okay, here's the deal. She hit on something that's absolutely key, and that's the economic numbers. And it doesn't matter whether you're looking at Republicans, Democrats, independents, they're not good for Trump. And the oldest modern political saw in the book, it's the economy stupid. We are 6 months away from election day. You cannot have people, new numbers out today. California gas prices in one county at $7 a gallon. You're not, even your base, his base is upset about inflation and about affordability. They don't like the war. I mean, the Epstein thing is, used to be a big thing for them too. It's like, man, that thing really is ticking us off. Where are the indictments, right? That was the big thing. That's even off the back burner right now because the economic issues are job one, fueled secondarily by the war.
I'm going to only have you for another minute or so, but I wanted to ask you about the cultural aspects to American politics that seem to inform so much. It seems as though when Trump gets in trouble, he talks about the trans, he talks about Christianity, he kind of throws these things at the wall to see what sticks. And mifepristone is this, it's an abortion pill. It's a medicine that's sent, of course, as you know, across the country and by prescription, of course. But it's really depended upon by so many women who want to make this difficult choice. There was just an update to the Supreme Court decision, cut 3, if you would, for Gary, on the back and forth on mifepristone, because an appeals court had blocked its distribution. This just happened over the weekend. And then just this morning, the Supreme Court has weighed in on this and now will allow the mifepristone medicines to be sent across. Go ahead, Mondo, if you would, please.
Last Friday, but essentially what the Supreme Court decision does is it puts a temporary hold on a ruling that was made last Friday by the Fifth Circuit that restricted nationwide women's access to getting mifepristone via telehealth appointments and via mail. So really curbing one of the key abortion drug medications. This, of course, is a major issue for women in states where there is an abortion ban, but also in other states across the country. Telehealth is the way that about a quarter of women get abortion drugs nowadays. So this had extreme consequences. For now, the Supreme Court has put this hold until May 11th. They've asked the state of Louisiana, who is the one that brought this case, to issue a response by May 7th. And Louisiana brought this case, just to explain a little bit, saying that they're being harmed as a state because there's a near total abortion ban in Louisiana, but they say that women there are still able to obtain these drugs via telehealth appointments, via mail. However, this case that they're bringing now has a nationwide impact that for now has been stopped by the Supreme Court.
So there you go, Gary. Tell me about the political ramifications of things like this. Are they a reminder of what the GOP has been about increasingly?
Well, they are, Mark, but this is the interesting thing about this case and this issue. For many people, this is really important, as you know, particularly for abortion rights advocates. But the thing about it is this really boils down to, in the end, more of a states' rights case than it does an abortion case. Why is that? Because Louisiana is saying, look, we have our own state ability, and the Supreme Court has affirmed this, to regulate abortion, but through telehealth and mail, it essentially renders our state policies moot. So that's what this, for many people, of course, it seems obvious it's an abortion case, but really it boils down to the states' rights issue. And this is what's going to be so delicate for the Supreme Court to ferret out and to try to explain, is what the rationale may be, whichever side they end up coming down on this. So is it going to animate voters? Maybe that's your point, Mark, coming into the midterms. It will some, but that's not going to be the overriding concern. The ones we've talked about so far, according to all the polling, and there'll be new polling as this issue is ferreted out. But for a lot of years, when you poll abortion, you have about 15% of the electorate, roughly speaking, that's a real decisive issue for them. But you're going to see economic issue again, Mark, take the lead amongst most voters.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hey, on the way out, just tell me, they're redistricting, of course. The redistricting where you are in California has already gone on, but in Virginia, there was just the voters passing their redistricting, and now with the Supreme Court decision that rules on what you can have in terms of minority districts, there's this mad dash, across so many red states to redistrict the hell out of every state. It's crazy. I say it's crazy just in the chaos, but also with the midterms approaching, can this get done in time, or the dust will not settle until 2028?
Well, there's going to be several cycles to come, Mark, where this is all going to be ferreted out in the full long term. 28 will be a big one. 30 will be a big one. 32 will be absolutely massive because it comes after the census. That's when the big, giant tidal wave of change could happen. We'll talk about that, I know, going forward. But in terms of right now, Florida's already moved ahead with their redistricting under DeSantis. And you're seeing states scramble. Some of them in the South are going to try to get this done before the midterms. But as we've talked in the past, the biggest challenge is it's state by state. Every state has their own primary dates, their own filing deadlines, their own state regulations for candidates. So that's why it's so absolutely crazy, chaotic, as you're talking about, Mark, because it's not a unified approach. As I tell people all the time, it's 50 state elections, truly, not one national election.
Gary, thank you. You can find Gary on iHeartRadio and across the CBS television stations. Happy mail-in voting, pal. Enjoy your day. All right. Gary Dietrich, everybody.